Sarah had always been different from other women in Willow Creek. While they spent their mornings tending gardens and sewing quilts, she could be found at the edge of town, rifle in hand, practicing her aim on tin cans lined up along the wooden fence. Her father, Thomas, had taught her everything he knew about shooting before the fever took him 3 winters ago. Now, at 22, Sarah could hit a playing card at 50 yards without breaking a sweat. The townsfolk whispered about her behind closed doors. Some called her strange, others said she was too proud for her own good. But when wolves threatened their livestock or when bandits were spotted near the trading routes, they all knew who to call. Sarah, the woman who never missed. She lived alone in a small cabin just outside town, surrounded by the rolling hills and vast prairies that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Her only companion was Thunder, a massive black horse her father had given her on her 18th birthday. The horse was as loyal as he was strong, and together they had traveled every inch of the territory, mapping trails and hunting grounds that even the most experienced didn't know existed. On this particular morning, Sarah was checking her rabbit snares when she noticed something unusual. Fresh, too many to count, leading from the main road toward her cabin. The prints were deep, suggesting heavily loaded horses. But what worried her most was the direction they came from. These tracks originated from Devil's Canyon, a place where only outlaws and desperados dared to venture. She followed the trail carefully, her hand resting on the grip of her Colt revolver. The prints led to a cluster of rocks about half a mile from her home, where it was clear that several men had dismounted and waited for hours. Cigarette butts and chewed tobacco told the story of their patience. They had been watching her cabin, studying her routine. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. Someone had been planning something, and she was clearly the target. She had made enemies over the years, mostly men whose pride couldn't handle being outshot by a woman. There was Jake, who had challenged her to a shooting contest last summer and lost badly in front of the whole town. There was also the gang, who had threatened her after she helped the sheriff track them through the mountains last spring. But as she examined the evidence more closely, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race with fear rather than anger. Among them were smaller marks, delicate impressions that could only belong to a woman's boots. Someone had brought a female captive to this hiding spot. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. These men hadn't come for her directly. They had taken someone else, someone she cared about, to draw her out. But who could it be? Sarah lived alone and kept to herself. She had few close friends in town, and her family was long gone. Then she remembered Lucy. Sweet, 17-year-old Lucy, the preacher's daughter who had been bringing Sarah fresh bread and vegetables every week since her father's death. Lucy was one of the few people in town who treated Sarah with genuine kindness, never judging her for her unconventional ways. The girl had visited just yesterday evening, staying longer than usual to help Sarah mend a torn saddle. Sarah's hands trembled as she mounted Thunder and raced back to town. The main street was busier than usual, with people gathered in small groups, their faces etched with worry. She spotted Sheriff Williams near the general store and called out to him. "Sheriff, what's happening? Why is everyone so upset?" The elderly lawman's face was grim as he approached her. "Sarah, thank God you're here. Lucy went missing last night. Her parents found her bedroom window open this morning, and there are signs of a struggle. We've been looking for her all day, but the trail goes cold at the river." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Her worst fears had been confirmed. The men who had been watching her cabin had taken Lucy, and she knew exactly why. They wanted to lure her into a trap, using the innocent girl as bait. "Sheriff, I think I know who took her," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "There were men watching my place, professional outlaws by the look of their tracks. This isn't a random kidnapping. They want me." Sheriff Williams nodded gravely. "I was afraid of that. You've made some dangerous enemies, Sarah. The question is, which ones would be bold enough to take a preacher's daughter?" Before Sarah could answer, young Tommy Fletcher came running down the street, waving a piece of paper in his hand. "Sheriff, miss, I found this nailed to the church door." Sarah snatched the note and read it aloud. "Sarah, your reputation with a rifle has cost us dearly. Now it's time to pay the price. The girl will remain safe as long as you come alone to Devil's Canyon at midnight. Bring your weapons. We aim to settle this once and for all. If you involve the law or bring help, the preacher's daughter will pay for your cowardice." The note was unsigned, but Sarah recognized the crude handwriting. She had seen it before on wanted posters throughout the territory. Black Pete, Jake's older brother and leader of the gang. The man was known for his cruelty and his hatred of anyone who had ever crossed his family. Sarah crumpled the note in her fist, her mind already racing with plans. She had 6 hours until midnight, 6 hours to prepare for what would likely be her final gunfight. The gang was notorious throughout the territory, and Black Pete had never been beaten in a fair fight. But this wouldn't be a fair fight. They had Lucy, which gave them every advantage. As she stood in the dusty street, surrounded by the worried faces of the townspeople, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would go to Devil's Canyon, just as they demanded. But she wouldn't go unprepared, and she certainly wouldn't go with the intention of fighting fair. If Black Pete wanted to play dirty, she would show him just how dirty a frontier woman could fight when someone she cared about was in danger. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the town. Sarah had work to do, and time was running short. Lucy's life depended on her being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than she had ever been before. The frontier's sharpest shot was about to face her greatest challenge, and failure was not an option. Sarah walked purposefully toward her cabin, Thunder's reins in her hand, while the entire town watched in tense silence. They all knew what midnight would bring, and many feared they were watching Sarah ride to her death. But Sarah had no intention of dying tonight. She had people to save and scores to settle, and Black Pete was about to learn why they called her the frontier's sharpest shot. Sarah's cabin felt different as she prepared for the night ahead. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the wooden floor sounded louder than before. She moved with methodical precision, checking each weapon in her collection with the care of someone who knew their life would depend on every bullet. Her father's Winchester rifle hung above the fireplace, its brass receiver gleaming in the lamplight. Sarah took it down reverently, running her fingers along the smooth stock that bore the scratches and wear marks of countless hunts. Thomas had carried this rifle through the Civil War and across 3 territories before settling in Willow Creek. Now it would serve his daughter in the fight of her life. She cleaned and loaded the Winchester with practiced efficiency, then turned her attention to her Colt revolver. The gun had never failed her, and tonight it would need to be perfect. Sarah checked each chamber, ensuring that every bullet was properly seated. 6 shots. In a gunfight against multiple opponents, 6 shots might not be enough, but they would have to do. As she worked, Sarah's mind wandered to Lucy. The girl had such bright eyes and an infectious laugh that could lighten even Sarah's darkest moods. Lucy never asked prying questions about Sarah's past or why she lived alone. She simply accepted Sarah for who she was, bringing fresh baked goods and stories from town without expecting anything in return. The thought of Lucy frightened and alone in some outlaw camp made Sarah's blood boil. She had to remind herself to stay calm, to think clearly. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. Black Pete was counting on her emotions to cloud her judgment, and she refused to give him that advantage. Sarah pulled out a leather satchel and began packing supplies. Extra ammunition, dried beef, a small medical kit, and a coil of strong rope. She also packed something that few people knew she possessed, a small Derringer pistol that had belonged to her mother. The tiny gun held only 2 shots, but it was perfectly concealed and might provide a crucial surprise if things went wrong. As the sun set completely, casting the prairie in darkness broken only by scattered stars, Sarah made her final preparations. She dressed in dark clothing that would blend with the night, tied her long auburn hair back tightly, and secured her weapons where they could be drawn quickly but wouldn't catch on branches or rocks. Thunder seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. The big horse stood perfectly still as Sarah saddled him, his ears constantly moving as he listened to the sounds of the night. She whispered words of encouragement to him, knowing that his speed and sure footing might be the difference between life and death before the night was over. Before leaving, Sarah sat down at her small wooden table and wrote a letter. If things went wrong, if Black Pete proved too clever or too quick, she wanted people to know the truth about what happened. She wrote about the kidnapping, about the trap that had been set for her, and about her decision to face the gang alone. She sealed the letter and left it prominently displayed on her table where it would be found. The ride to Devil's Canyon took 2 hours across rough terrain that Sarah knew like the back of her hand. She kept Thunder at a steady pace, conserving the horse's energy for whatever lay ahead. The night was clear and cold, with enough starlight to navigate the familiar trails without difficulty. As she rode, Sarah thought about her father's lessons. Thomas had taught her that shooting accurately was only part of being a gunfighter. The real skill was in reading people, understanding their intentions, and staying one step ahead of their plans. "A smart shooter stays alive longer than a fast one," he used to say. But a smart and fast shooter is damn near unstoppable. Devil's Canyon earned its name from the treacherous rock formations that created perfect hiding spots for ambushes. The narrow passages twisted and turned like a maze, with countless places where a person could disappear or be trapped. Sarah had explored the canyon many times over the years, hunting deer and mapping the water sources. That knowledge might be her only advantage tonight. She stopped Thunder at the canyon's entrance and studied the terrain ahead. Flickering light deep in the canyon told her that the gang was already in position. They had built a campfire, which was either incredibly careless or a deliberate signal. Knowing Black Pete's reputation, Sarah suspected it was the latter. He wanted her to know exactly where he was waiting. Sarah dismounted and led Thunder into the canyon on foot, moving slowly and silently through the shadows. The rocky walls rose high on both sides, creating an echo chamber where even the smallest sound would carry. She could smell wood smoke and hear the faint murmur of voices ahead. After 20 minutes of careful movement, Sarah reached a position where she could observe the outlaw camp without being seen. 5 men sat around a large fire, their weapons within easy reach. Black Pete was easy to identify by his massive size and the distinctive scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Lucy sat near the fire, her hands bound but otherwise unharmed. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her at seeing the girl alive and apparently uninjured. But as she watched the camp, Sarah realized that something was wrong. The setup was too obvious, too easy. Black Pete was many things, but he wasn't stupid. No experienced outlaw would expose himself so completely without good reason. This was definitely a trap, but the real danger was still hidden. Sarah spent the next hour slowly circling the camp, staying well out of sight while she searched for the other gang members. Her patience was rewarded when she spotted movement in the rocks above the campfire. At least 3 more men were positioned in elevated hiding spots, with clear lines of fire down into the canyon. If she had walked directly into the camp as they expected, she would have been caught in a devastating crossfire. The clock in Sarah's mind told her it was nearly midnight. Soon, Black Pete would start wondering why she hadn't appeared. If she waited much longer, they might assume she wasn't coming and decide to leave with Lucy. But if she moved too quickly, she would be walking into certain death. Sarah found a secure position behind a large boulder and checked her weapons one final time. The Winchester was loaded and ready, the Colt sat comfortably in its holster, and the Derringer was hidden in her boot. She had 17 bullets total to face at least 8 armed men. The odds were not in her favor, but she had faced worse situations before. From her hiding spot, Sarah could hear Black Pete's voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Sarah, I know you're out there. Time's running out for the preacher's daughter. Show yourself or we start making her uncomfortable." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life. Every hunting trip, every shooting contest, every hour spent practicing her quick draw had led to this night. Lucy's life hung in the balance, and Sarah was the only person who could save her. The Frontier's sharpest shot was about to demonstrate why her reputation had spread across 3 territories. Black Pete and his gang were about to learn that some mistakes cost more than money or pride. Sometimes they cost everything. Sarah took one final look at the outlaw camp below before making her move. She had identified 8 men total, with Black Pete clearly in command. 3 shooters were hidden in elevated positions among the rocks, while 5 others remained near the campfire with Lucy. The girl looked tired and frightened, but was sitting upright and alert, which meant she hadn't been seriously harmed. The plan forming in Sarah's mind was dangerous and relied heavily on surprise. She couldn't win a straight gunfight against 8 experienced outlaws, but she didn't need to fight them all at once. If she could eliminate the hidden shooters first, she might have a chance against the men around the fire. Sarah began her approach by climbing higher into the rocks, using skills her father had taught her during their hunting expeditions. She moved like a shadow, testing each foothold before putting her full weight on it, avoiding loose stones that might alert her enemies to her presence. The Winchester remained slung across her back while she climbed, its weight familiar and comforting. The first hidden shooter was positioned about 30 feet above the campfire, crouched behind a natural wall of stone with his rifle pointed down toward the canyon floor. Sarah could see him clearly in the starlight, a thin man with a scraggly beard who kept shifting nervously as he waited for her to appear. Sarah drew her knife, the blade her father had given her for her 16th birthday. In close quarters, a blade was quieter than a gun and just as deadly if used properly. She approached the shooter from behind, moving with the patience of a hunter stalking a buck. One mistake, one sound, and the entire plan would collapse. The outlaw never heard her coming. Sarah's hand covered his mouth while the knife found its mark between his ribs. He died quickly and quietly, his rifle clattering softly against the rocks as his grip relaxed. Sarah caught the weapon before it could fall and give away her position. Two hidden shooters remained, both positioned on the opposite side of the canyon. Sarah would have to cross exposed ground to reach them, but the darkness and the echo-distorting properties of the canyon walls would work in her favor. She began moving again, this time with the dead man's rifle in addition to her own weapons. Black Pete's voice boomed through the canyon again. "You've got 5 more minutes, then we start hurting the girl." Sarah gritted her teeth and forced herself to maintain her careful pace. Black Pete was trying to rush her into making a mistake, but she wouldn't take the bait. Lucy had survived this long, she could hold on a little longer. The second shooter was younger than the first, maybe 20 years old with nervous eyes that darted constantly between different sections of the canyon. He was positioned behind a cluster of boulders that provided excellent cover but limited his field of vision. Sarah was able to get within 10 feet of him before he sensed her presence. The young outlaw started to turn, his mouth opening to shout a warning, but Sarah was faster. The Winchester butt struck him in the temple with enough force to drop him instantly. He crumpled without making a sound, his rifle sliding down the rocky slope toward the canyon floor. Sarah winced as the weapon clattered against the stones below. The sound echoed through the canyon like thunder, and she knew her stealth approach was over. Shouts erupted from the campfire area as the remaining outlaws realized they were under attack. "Somebody's up in the rocks," one of them yelled. "Jake and Tom ain't answering." "Find her," Black Pete roared. "She's here somewhere." Sarah abandoned stealth and ran toward the third shooter's position. Speed was her only ally now. She could hear men scrambling through the rocks below, searching for her with growing desperation. The element of surprise was gone, but she had eliminated 2 of the 8 opponents and gained valuable intelligence about their positions. The third shooter was the most dangerous of the group. Sarah could see him moving through the shadows with the confidence of an experienced fighter. He had heard the commotion and was actively hunting for her rather than waiting passively in his hiding spot. This would be her most challenging opponent yet. Sarah found a defensive position behind a fallen boulder and waited for him to come to her. The Winchester was ready in her hands, and she controlled her breathing the way her father had taught her. "Patience wins gunfights," his voice echoed in her memory. "Let them come to you when you can't go to them." The outlaw appeared suddenly, his rifle sweeping the area where Sarah was hidden. She had a clear shot, but taking it would reveal her position to the men below. Instead, she waited until he moved closer, then struck with the rifle butt just as she had with the second shooter. But this outlaw was more experienced than his younger companion. He saw the attack coming and managed to partially block it with his weapon. The impact sent both fighters sprawling across the rocky ground, their rifles skittering away into the darkness. Sarah rolled to her feet and drew her Colt revolver, but the outlaw was already diving for cover behind another boulder. She fired twice, the shots echoing like thunder through the canyon, but the bullets sparked harmlessly off the rocks where he had disappeared. "She's up here," the man shouted to his companions below. "North side about 50 yards up." Sarah cursed under her breath and started moving again. Her position was compromised, and the remaining 5 outlaws would be converging on her location within minutes. She had to get back down to the canyon floor where she could use the terrain to her advantage and try to rescue Lucy before the situation deteriorated further. The climb down was treacherous in the darkness, made worse by the need for speed. Sarah could hear the outlaws spreading out through the canyon, calling to each other as they coordinated their search. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they surrounded her completely. As she reached the canyon floor, Sarah could see the campfire clearly for the first time. Lucy was still sitting where she had been, but now Black Pete stood directly behind her with a large knife pressed against her throat. The message was clear. Any wrong move from Sarah would result in the girl's death. "Sarah," Black Pete called out, his voice carrying easily through the canyon. "I know you can hear me. You've caused me a lot of trouble tonight, but it's time to end this." Step into the light where I can see you, or the preacher's daughter pays for your stubbornness. Sarah found herself at the moment of truth. She had eliminated 3 of the 8 outlaws, but 5 remained, including their leader. Lucy was in immediate danger, and Sarah's ammunition was running low. The smart thing to do would be to retreat and get help from town, but by the time she returned, Lucy would be dead or gone forever. Looking at the terrified girl illuminated by the flickering campfire, Sarah made her decision. She had come this far, and she wouldn't abandon Lucy now. The frontier's sharpest shot was about to face her greatest challenge, and she would meet it head-on. Sarah stepped forward into the firelight, her Colt revolver held steady in her right hand. "I'm here. Let the girl go. Your fight is with me." Black Pete's face split into a cruel grin. "Well, well, the famous Sarah finally shows herself. You've killed 3 of my men tonight, lady. That's a debt that needs paying." "Your men shouldn't have taken an innocent girl," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Let her go and we'll settle this properly, just you and me." Black Pete laughed, the sound harsh and unforgiving. "You think you're in a position to make demands? I've got 4 guns pointed at you right now, and this pretty little thing is 1 heartbeat away from meeting her maker." Sarah could see the other outlaws emerging from the shadows, their weapons trained on her. She was surrounded and apparently trapped. But appearances could be deceiving, and Sarah had learned long ago that the most dangerous predator was often the one that looked defeated. The final confrontation was about to begin, and only one side would walk away from Devil's Canyon alive. Sarah stood in the circle of firelight, surrounded by 4 armed outlaws with their leader holding a knife to Lucy's throat. To any observer, she appeared trapped and defeated, but Sarah had spent her entire life in situations where others held the obvious advantages, and she had learned that survival often depended on seeing opportunities that others missed. The campfire created a pool of light in the darkness, but it also created shadows and blind spots. Sarah's eyes had adjusted to the night during her climb through the rocks, while the outlaws had been staring into the flames for hours. Their night vision was compromised, which meant they couldn't see clearly beyond the fire's glow. "You've got quite a reputation, miss," Black Pete said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "They say you're the finest shot in 3 territories. Tonight, we find out if that reputation is deserved." "Let the girl go first," Sarah replied, her Colt revolver held steady despite the overwhelming odds. "She has nothing to do with whatever grievance you have against me." Black Pete's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, but she has everything to do with it. You see, you cost my family considerable money when you helped the sheriff track us through the mountains last spring. My brother Jake lost a lot of face when you outshot him in front of the whole town. The name means something in these parts, and you've been damaging our reputation." Sarah kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. She needed to buy time, to find some advantage in what seemed like a hopeless situation. "So this is about pride? You're willing to hurt an innocent girl because your brother couldn't handle losing to a woman." "This is about respect," Black Pete snarled, pressing the knife closer to Lucy's throat. The girl whimpered softly, tears streaming down her face. "And about showing folks what happens when they cross the family." One of the other outlaws, a stocky man with a full beard, shifted nervously. "Pete, maybe we should just take her guns and get out of here. The sheriff's bound to come looking eventually." "Shut up, Hawkins," Black Pete snapped. "We finished this tonight the way it should have been finished months ago." Sarah noticed the exchange with interest. Not all of the outlaws were comfortable with the situation. The man called Hawkins was clearly having second thoughts about kidnapping and threatening a preacher's daughter. That uncertainty might be something she could exploit. "Your man's right," Sarah said, addressing the gang leader while keeping her eyes on all 4 opponents. "The sheriff knows where I went tonight. If I don't come back by dawn, he'll bring a posse to tear this canyon apart stone by stone." It was a lie, but a convincing one. Sarah had specifically chosen not to involve the law because she feared for Lucy's safety, but the outlaws didn't know that. Black Pete's confidence wavered slightly. "Nice try, lady, but I don't believe you. No lawman worth his badge would let a civilian ride into a trap alone." "Believe what you want," Sarah shrugged. "But when 20 armed men come riding through that canyon entrance at first light, don't say you weren't warned." Hawkins exchanged nervous glances with another outlaw, a young man who couldn't have been more than 19. Sarah could see doubt spreading through the group like wildfire. These men were used to robbing stagecoaches and rustling cattle, not taking hostages and facing down legendary gunfighters. "Maybe we should consider her offer," the young outlaw whispered to Hawkins. "Take her guns and ride out while we still can." Black Pete heard the whisper and his face darkened with rage. "I said we finish this. Any man who wants to run can do it on his own, but Sarah dies tonight, and anyone who has a problem with that can join her." The threat had the opposite effect that Black Pete intended. Instead of solidifying the gang's resolve, it created visible cracks in their unity. Hawkins took a small step backward, his rifle lowering slightly. The young outlaw licked his lips nervously and glanced toward the canyon entrance as if calculating his chances of escape. Sarah recognized the moment when it arrived. In any group of fighters, there came a point where doubt and fear undermined discipline. When that happened, individual survival instincts took over, and coordinated action became impossible. The gang had reached that point. "Last chance," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had made her reputation. "Let the girl go, and we settle this between you and me. Fair fight, best gun wins." Black Pete's eyes narrowed. "You think you can take me in a fair fight?" "I know I can," Sarah replied without hesitation. "The question is whether you have the courage to face me without hiding behind a hostage and 4 hired guns." The insult hit its mark. Black Pete's face flushed red with anger, and Sarah could see his grip on the knife tightening. But she also saw something else in his eyes: uncertainty. Despite all his bluster, Black Pete wasn't entirely sure he could beat Sarah in a straight gunfight. "Tell you what," Black Pete said slowly, his voice thoughtful now rather than angry. "We'll make it interesting. You and me, pistols at 20 paces. If you win, my boys ride out and leave you both alone. If I win, well, you won't be caring much about what happens after that." Sarah pretended to consider the offer while actually studying the positions of the other outlaws. Hawkins and the young man had moved farther from the fire, clearly preparing to run if things went wrong. The other 2 remained loyal to their leader, but seemed nervous about the proposed duel. "What about guarantees?" Sarah asked. "How do I know your men won't shoot me in the back when the fight starts?" "You have my word," Black Pete said, releasing Lucy and pushing her away from the fire. The girl stumbled and fell but immediately scrambled toward the canyon wall, putting distance between herself and the outlaws. "The word of a man who kidnaps innocent girls?" Sarah smiled coldly. "I'll need something better than that." Black Pete's patience was running out. "This is the only deal you're going to get, lady. Take it, or we end this right here with overwhelming force." Sarah nodded slowly. "Fair enough, 20 paces it is." She began walking backward, counting steps, while keeping her Colt trained on the gang leader. Black Pete moved in the opposite direction, his hand hovering over his own weapon. The other outlaws spread out to give them room, though Sarah noticed that Hawkins and his young companion continued backing toward the canyon entrance. At 20 paces, the 2 fighters stopped and faced each other across the flickering firelight. The canyon fell silent except for the soft crackling of burning wood and the distant sound of wind through the rocks above. "Anytime you're ready, miss," Black Pete called out, his hand steady above his holstered pistol. Sarah took a deep breath and centered herself the way her father had taught her. The world narrowed to just her and her opponent, everything else fading into background noise. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, her vision sharpening, her hand becoming perfectly steady. "Draw," Black Pete shouted, his hand flashing toward his gun. Sarah's Colt cleared leather with practiced smoothness, the motion so fluid it seemed effortless. But instead of firing at Black Pete, she pivoted left and put 2 bullets into the outlaw who had been trying to flank her from the shadows. The man dropped with a cry of pain and surprise. Black Pete's shot went wide as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. Sarah spun back toward him, her revolver already lined up on his chest. Their eyes met across the firelight, and she saw the exact moment when he realized he had been beaten. "Drop your gun," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. Black Pete looked around desperately and saw that his remaining men had scattered. Hawkins and the young outlaw had already disappeared into the canyon's entrance. The other 2 were running for their horses, abandoning their leader without a backward glance. Alone, and Black Pete slowly raised his hands and let his pistol fall to the ground. "You win, lady, but this ain't over. The family has a long memory." "The family just lost their leader," Sarah replied calmly. "I suggest you take this opportunity to reconsider your life choices." She kept her gun trained on him while she called to Lucy. "Lucy, are you hurt?" The girl emerged from the shadows, shaken but unharmed. "I'm okay, Miss Sarah. Thank you for coming for me." Sarah smiled at the brave young woman while keeping one eye on Black Pete. "Let's go home, Lucy. The sun will be up soon and your parents are worried sick." As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon, Sarah reflected on the night's events. She had faced 8 armed outlaws and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, planning, and pure determination. The frontier's sharpest shot had lived up to her reputation once again. But more importantly, she had saved an innocent girl and struck a blow against the kind of men who preyed on the weak and defenseless. In a harsh land where justice often came at the end of a gun barrel, Sarah had proven that sometimes the good guys really did win. The ride back to Willow Creek was peaceful and quiet, with thunder carrying both women safely through the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, Devil's Canyon returned to its usual silence, marked only by the dying embers of an outlaw campfire and the abandoned weapons of men who had learned too late that some mistakes carry a price higher than they were willing to pay. By the time the sun rose over the eastern mountains, Sarah was home, her mission accomplished and her reputation secure. The frontier's sharpest shot had faced her greatest challenge and emerged victorious, ready for whatever dangers the vast territory might bring her way.